So I talked to Colt.
Oh my gosh. Where is he at now?
He's in Brazil.
He went to Brazil?
Yeah, to see the other woman. Saying the ligaments in his knee need to be replaced. So he has to have another surgery. But he said he's found a doctor here that will accept the insurance.
Here?
He had such a deep, intense connection, and you can't just turn that off. I feel like Colt has some type of crazy power over me, and I don't really trust myself with him.
Colt cheated, ran straight toward another woman, and somehow Courtney is still the one opening the door when he needs help most. That is the part that makes this sting, because she is not getting a call to finally expose him, shut him down, or slam the story closed. She is getting pulled back in by the same man who already proved what kind of damage he can do. So the question is no longer whether Colt can be trusted, because that answer already exists. The real question is why the bond is still alive after the truth should have killed it. Welcome back, I'm Sabrine Rose, and if you follow messy relationship stories where feelings keep surviving facts, subscribe and stay close, and tell me in the comments one thing: when an ex hurts you this badly, is helping them kindness, weakness, or the first sign you never fully let go? Because this is where the story gets dangerous in a quiet way. Courtney is not saying she wants Colt back. She is not standing there selling some big reunion fantasy. She is framing it like a small practical favor. He needs help. He needs a ride. He needs to get settled. That sounds harmless until you remember who he is, what he did, and how these situations work when one person still has emotional access. A cheating ex does not need a second chance speech if he already knows he can still get a response. And that is what makes this harder to watch. Colt went off to Brazil, got involved with another woman, and still found a route back into Courtney's space through need, injury, and timing. So now the whole story shifts. This is not about fresh betrayal, this is about what happens after betrayal. When the facts are ugly, the feelings are not dead, and the person who got hurt starts calling contact a favor instead of what it may be, a reopening. Courtney insists the help is limited, controlled, nothing bigger than basic decency. Her parents hear that and immediately know this may be a lot more than a ride. The facts are already bad enough without anybody adding drama on top. Colt cheated, then went to Brazil to see Diana while Courtney was left trying to recover from the mess he created. That alone should have been enough to seal the case. That alone should have pushed this story into the category of painful but finished. Instead, it hangs open, and that is where the tension starts to feel less like gossip and more like a pattern nobody wants to name too early. Because once those facts are set, the issue is no longer confusion. Courtney is not missing information. She knows what happened. Her parents know what happened. The audience knows what happened. So if contact is opening again, it is not because the truth got lost. It is because truth and attachment do not always move at the same speed. One can be clear while the other is still dragging its feet. And that delay is where people get pulled back into situations they already know are bad for them. That is why renewed contact feels risky even before anything dramatic happens. Injury makes Colt look vulnerable. Need makes the call sound practical. Sympathy softens the edges. But none of that erases the history sitting underneath the moment. If anything, it makes the setup harder to read. Because now the same person who caused the damage gets to return wearing a softer face. And Courtney seems to be standing right in that split. To her parents, this sounds contained, like a favor with limits. But the more she tries to make it sound small, the more it starts to feel like she is not only managing their fear, she is trying to manage her own. Courtney's parents are not overreacting here. And that matters, because this scene works only if their fear feels earned. They are not dealing with some harmless ex who made one mistake and faded into the background. They are reacting to a man who cheated on their daughter, disappeared into another situation with another woman, and still managed to circle back the moment he needed something. So when Courtney brings up helping him, they do not hear kindness first. They hear trouble with better packaging. That is why her father's warning lands as hard as it does. He is not getting distracted by the surgery, the airport, or the hotel plan. He goes straight to the part underneath all that. Does this man want to get back with you? And then the line gets even sharper when he basically says, do not let that happen, because he is not going to be faithful. That is not random parental panic. That is pattern recognition. That is a man hearing one small favor and already seeing the emotional cost attached to it. And Courtney, at least on the surface, tries to keep everything calm. She presents the plan like a neat little errand, like she is above the chaos now, like she is helping without reopening anything. But her parents are reading the part she is not saying out loud. They are reading history. They are reading chemistry. They are reading the way unfinished feelings can turn a simple ride into a full emotional backslide before anybody even admits one is happening. Miserable little magic trick. The way bad men keep returning as one small favor, that is what makes the scene heavier than basic family disapproval. Her parents are not only afraid of Colt, they are afraid of what happens to Courtney when Colt gets close enough to matter again. And that fear says more than any lecture ever could a ride to the airport. A drop-off at a hotel. On paper, that sounds tiny, almost too ordinary to question, and that is exactly why scenes like this get dangerous so fast. Relationship relapse does not usually come back with fireworks and a giant speech about unfinished love. It comes back looking polite. It comes back looking useful. It comes back dressed up as decency, as timing. As someone needing help at the exact moment you want to believe helping does not mean reopening anything. So why does this one ride matter so much? Because the ride is not the story. The contact is the story. The access is the story. Once feelings are still active, no interaction is fully neutral, and Courtney's own situation has already told us that this is not some emotionally dead connection where two people can handle logistics like strangers. If that were true, her parents would not react the way they do, and she would not need to keep shrinking the moment down into something that sounds safe. That is the clever little trap inside all of this. The hotel plan sounds like a boundary. She is not taking him home. She is not moving him back in. She is not announcing some reunion. She is drawing a line that looks firm enough to calm everyone down, including herself. But sometimes a neat boundary is not a wall. Sometimes it is a story you tell so the first step does not feel like a first step. And that is why this moment carries more weight than it should. Courtney may be trying to prove she is in control. She may even believe she is. But when a person who hurt you still has emotional access, a favor does not always stay a favor. Sometimes the smallest limit is the first one to crack, and once that happens, the whole situation starts looking less like help and more like the beginning of something she swore was over. The whole story shifts the second Courtney admits the one thing people usually hide when they are trying to look in control. She does not say she misses him in some soft romantic way. She says she does not trust herself with him. And that line hits harder than any recap of the cheating ever could. Because now the problem is no longer whether Colt did enough damage to lose her trust. He did. The problem is that losing trust did not kill the pull. And that is where this stops being frustrating in a simple way and starts feeling dangerous in a more honest one. Because Courtney is not standing in ignorance. She is not making excuses because she has no clue who he is. She knows. She knows he cheated. She knows he ran towards somebody else. She knows her parents are scared for a reason. So if the attachment is still alive after all that, then information is not the missing piece. The missing piece is distance strong enough to hold when emotion starts making old access feel familiar again. That is why self-awareness does not calm this story down. It makes it worse. She can see the cliff and still feel herself walking toward the edge. And that is the ugly part people do not like to admit out loud. Sometimes anger is fresh, but attachment is older. Anger can be loud for a week. Attachment can sit in the body much longer, quiet and stubborn, waiting for the perfect excuse to wake back up. Add injury to the mix, add sympathy, add history, and suddenly the heart starts dressing risk up as compassion. That does not make Courtney foolish. It makes her exposed. So the emotional center of this is no longer the cheating by itself. That was the blast. This part is what happens after the smoke clears. When the damage is obvious, the feelings are not dead, and one small act of help starts looking like a test she may not be ready to pass. Colt does not need some giant speech in this story to feel dangerous. And that is part of what makes the whole thing harder to dismiss. His effect is already doing the work. He cheated, he went off toward another woman, and still the second he reappears in a moment of need, the emotional weather around Courtney changes. That tells you something uncomfortable, because moral credibility and emotional influence are not always lost at the same time. A person can prove they are bad for you and still keep the key to the room you were trying to lock. To be fair, there is a softer reading. He is hurt. He needs surgery. Courtney wants to be decent. One ride does not equal reunion. One favor does not erase betrayal. All of that is true, and pretending otherwise would flatten the story into cheap outrage. But the harder truth sits right beside it. A sincere favor still creates contact. Contact still creates access. Access still carries a cost when the attachment is not dead. That is the part people like to skip because logistics sound cleaner than emotions, and humans are always trying to rename the mess so it feels smaller. And Colt does not have to force anything for this to matter. He does not need to talk her into a fantasy. He does not need to win some moral debate. If Courtney is already emotionally affected by his presence, then the argument is not the point. The reopening is the point. That is why the setup feels so loaded even when the action sounds small. The risk is not only what Colt wants. The risk is what one more interaction wakes up in Courtney, and whether she is underestimating how expensive one small act of help can become once the wrong person gets back inside the frame, not only a ride. That is the kind of sentence people use when they are trying to make a bad idea sound mature. Only a ride, only a hotel drop-off, only basic kindness. Meanwhile, her parents are sitting there hearing the part underneath it, which is not transportation, not logistics, not some noble little favor, but access, and once access is back on the table, all the old damage starts breathing again. That is why this scene gets sharper the longer you sit with it. Courtney is talking like a woman managing a schedule. Everybody else is reacting like they know she is standing 2 inches away from a pattern she has not fully escaped. And that is where the whole thing starts to feel less random and more familiar. Colt does not need to sweep back in with grand gestures. He does not need some dramatic apology tour. Apparently, all he has to do is show up wounded, inconvenient, and in need, and suddenly the woman he hurt is the one arranging the practical details. That is not romance. That is worse. Romance would at least be honest. This is emotional backdoor access with a polite face on it. But the reason this hits is because Courtney is not dumb. She is not being tricked by missing facts. She knows what happened. Her parents know what happened. The audience knows what happened. So when she keeps shrinking this down into something harmless, the question gets harder, not easier. Is she being kind, or is she slowly editing the story into a version she can survive? Is this a rescue, or the first soft excuse in a repeat she is trying not to name out loud? Because by now, the tension is not sitting in Colt's next move. The tension is sitting in Courtney's. If she is still calling this small, there's a good chance the first compromise has already happened, and she may be closer to the old pole than she wants anyone, including herself, to see that some breakups end in conversation and some only end on paper, because the body still remembers the pattern long after the mind has filed the complaint. That is why Courtney's situation hits a nerve beyond one messy reality TV couple. A lot of people have lived some version of this, where the facts are settled, the red flags are obvious, the warnings are almost embarrassing in how clear they are, and yet the reflex to answer, to help, to soften, to stay reachable never fully died. So this stops being a story about one bad ex and starts becoming a story about what happens when truth arrives before detachment does. And that is where people get themselves in trouble while sounding completely reasonable. They name the red flags, they repeat the history, they admit the person hurt them, and then they stay available anyway, like awareness alone is supposed to protect them. But naming a bad pattern does not weaken it if the door is still unlocked. Sometimes it does the opposite. Sometimes it proves you can see the fire and still keep your hand near the stove because part of you keeps hoping this time the burn will not come the same way. That is why Courtney's parents matter so much in this story. They are not caught in memory the way she is. They are not pulled by chemistry, guilt, or the strange little loyalty people keep for someone who already failed them. They are seeing the full picture without the fog. And from that distance, the danger looks plain. Not because helping someone is wrong by itself, but because helping the wrong person while pretending your feelings are under control is how old wounds quietly get reopened. So the question sitting underneath all of this keeps getting sharper. Is what Courtney feels after betrayal still love? Or only residue? Is her compassion strength? Or is it exposure dressed up to look noble? And if she already knows better, What happens if the attachment still gets the final vote? By this point, the shape of the story is hard to ignore, because every piece is now pointing in the same direction. Colt cheated. He went to another woman. Then when he needed help, he reached back toward Courtney, and Courtney, despite everything, was still close enough to answer. That is what makes this feel heavier than one awkward favor. The facts already killed the fantasy. What they did not kill was the access. And that is where all the earlier warning signs start locking into place. Courtney tried to frame the contact like it was contained, neat, nothing more than a practical act of decency. Her parents heard the danger right away, because from the outside this never looked like a simple ride. It looked like the return of a pattern. Then Courtney herself gave the whole thing away when she admitted she does not trust herself around him. Once that line is on the table, the airport pickup stops sounding small. It starts sounding like the kind of moment people only recognize as a turning point after the damage is already moving again. That is the dread sitting underneath this story now. Not the cheating by itself, not even the injury by itself. The dread is that awareness is present, but awareness is not the same as discipline. She sees the problem. She knows the history. She hears her parents, and still, contact has reopened. So the verdict is forming even before anyone says it out loud. The scariest part is not that Colt came back into the picture. The scariest part is that he did not have to break the door down, because some part of Courtney may have already left it unlocked. What we watched was not some grand reunion, and it was not clean closure either. It was something messier, which is why it feels so real. A man who already betrayed Courtney found his way back into her space through need, timing, and one small request, and a woman who knows better still was not emotionally far enough away to make that contact feel harmless. That is the plain truth of it. The harder truth is uglier. Trust can die before attachment does. Respect can collapse before the reflex to care goes with it. And once that happens, the danger changes shape. It stops looking like obvious romance and starts looking like decency, guilt, history, or one more favor you swear means nothing. In my opinion, that is why this story lands the way it does. Betrayal does not always end a relationship. Sometimes it only changes the form of the danger. And that leaves Courtney in the saddest place of all, because this is no longer about whether Colt earned another chance. He did not. It is about whether she can protect herself from a bond that still has some life in it, even after all the proof. Which opens the next question almost on its own, because the more you sit with this story, the harder it gets to ignore. Did Colt come back only because he needed help, or did he come back because he knew Courtney was still the one person he could still reach?